They called her just the help in Barrow's Bend. But her hands knew the weight of work and the patience of hours. The town sat low against the prairie like an old dog curled by its master's chair. Stubborn, tired, and loyal. Dust lay in the gutters and on the window sills like a memory no one could quite shake. The saloon sign creaked in the wind and made the same tired sound every afternoon, as if it had been practicing for its last breath for decades. When the wind came off the plain, it blew through the cracked panes of the boarding house and tasted like hay and long-ago rain. Mare Hollis was the boarding house's constant. She rose before dawn to stoke the stove that never truly warmed the old place, to light the kerosene lamps that threw a thin, steady glow across scarred tables and a floor that had kept the shape of too many boot soles. She tied back her hair in a practical braid and put on an apron that had seen better years. Her hands were calloused, not from fighting but from a lifetime of doing what needed to be done. Kneading stale dough into warm biscuits, washing shirts until the collars softened, rubbing the grime from men's faces at the end of a dusty day. People in Barrow's Bend watched her as if she were part of the furniture. Present, expected, necessary. If she had let them name her, they would have called her plain-spoken, steady, grit-tough. They might have noticed the way she stood, back straight, chin like an unturned lock, and the way her eyes softened when she thought no one was watching. They might have told the truth if someone had asked, that she was kind-eyed and unspent in a way that frightened them, that the quiet around her was not emptiness but a shield. But no one had asked. Folks made up their own stories and spoke them loudly where she could hear. "You're the boardin' house lady, ain't ye?" Mr. Grimes, the blacksmith, said one afternoon, loud enough for the whole room. He had a way of making a joke into a declaration, of setting his words down like horseshoes. "'Bout time you take the new fellow's room. Don't see why a single gal oughta have the best bed." Mare's hands didn't stop. The rag under her palm moved in a steady circle over the table, as if that motion alone could scrub a man clean of his rudeness. She kept her head down. She always kept her head down. The kitchen stove hissed softly, the kettle joining in like a small, sympathetic voice. "You got a man hidin' in that kitchen, Grimes?" called someone else, a woman whose hat was fat with lace and a pinion. "Heard she lost a husband up north. Bring him round sometime, Mare. Don't need men round 'ere who can't pull their weight." Mare heard the words like the scrape of a boot on a board. They were meant to bruise. She felt the heat rise in her chest but pushed it down, like tending a coal so the fire wouldn't leap. She didn't answer. She wiped, folded, stacked in the steady rhythm of someone who had learned a life must go on. Her silence was an armor. The kettle screamed small and hot, and she poured coffee into tin mugs, sliding them across the counter with a certainty that was part of a promise. "You have your work, I have mine. Nothing will break if we keep the day straight." He walked into Barrow's Bend as if he had been expected. The rancher, Rafe Calder, they called him, though some men muttered other things as they watched his horse's sure step, was a large man in a way that could not be faked. He carried his history like a well-made saddle, heavy, shaped to his frame, and a little worn where the leather had been rubbed thin. His hat shaded eyes that had the patience of winter, cold on the surface, but steady, always watching. He wore boots softened by miles and time, a coat patched at the shoulder, and a belt with a buckle that had shined once like a promise. Rafe never spoke much, and people in town built meaning out of that. They said he had a past. Some whispered he had been in the wrong kind of war, or on the wrong side of a rustler's ledger. Others said his land had a debt upon it, that he was running it for someone else. But the truth of him was simpler and sadder. The ranch had names attached to it he did not like to say, bills that kept coming, and a girl who had been called someone else's in a different life. He had come to Barrow's Bend to tend to cattle and to be alone the way the prairie asks folks to be. His first night he walked into the boarding house plain as a man looking for a room. Mare was smoothing out a sheet by lamplight when he came in, the door creaking behind him in a sound she knew well. He stopped, a silhouette against the cool night, and the lamplight fell across him, catching dust motes and making them dance. "You got any rooms?" His voice was steady as a rope. It did not ask much. Mare looked at him in the half-light and saw more than the town had bothered to. the tightness at the corners of his eyes that moved with him when he thought, the way he kept his elbows tucked as if to preserve warmth. She felt a small, sharp recognition, an echo of someone who had learned to hold herself inward when the world was loud. "Yes," she said. Her voice was a low thing practiced in being useful. "Down the hall. Small but clean. Breakfast at 6 inch. Rafe nodded. He set his hat on the table, and his hands, when they uncurled, showed small scars and a gentleness that didn't fit the stories. He carried a weather-worn letter tied with a faded ribbon, as if proof of something he refused to let go of. For reasons he would not say, he kept it close. Days folded into each other like the edges of a well-used blanket. Rafe rode out early, with the sun at his back, and came in just as the light softened. He was a quiet presence. He was not the one who laughed loud in public or made the jokes that meant to impress. He was the one who fixed a fence with the same slow attention Mare used to scrub out a stubborn pan. When he came into the dining room, he took up the same side of the table as always, and when he ate with a measured hunger, as if keeping the measure of his days kept his past from spilling out into the room. People took note, mostly in corners. Mrs. Larn, who had a nose for gossip and a tongue that liked to sharpen words, watched Rafe like someone watching a horse suspicious of its bridle. There was an old sheriff in town who liked to take credit for knowing more than he did, and he grumbled when Rafe would not bow to his questions. Still, most left them to their steady ways. Barrow's Bend had long learned that some people were like rivers. They refused to freeze when the weather told them to. Mare's life had a rhythm that bruised and then healed in the same day. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of the kettle, to boots and to the clink of plates. She mended a shirt here, stepped in to break a fight there, and gave a quiet word where it might help. She kept a garden out back that was just a tangle of stubborn things. Beans that had learned to climb where they could, herbs that smelled faintly of someone else's kitchen, and she brought green inside in a way that warmed the old room she called her own. She kept to herself because a person can run out of words when their life is full of listening to others. One damp spring morning changed the balance like a stone dropped in a still pond. A freight wagon came through carrying a child. The city folk had been traveling, and they had left a little boy coughing, a skin like paper and eyes rimmed with red. The mother had been on the road, somewhere beyond the next county, and she could not keep him. The father had boarded with them, weak as a candle, and his strength had slipped too fast. The little boy's name was Tommy, and he arrived with a cough that sounded like grief. They left him under Mare's care because he did not have one to guard him in their box of wrecked plans. She took him up like something fragile and permanent. She fed him broth warm enough to make his lips pink. She wrapped his hands in clean rags and kept him in a corner of the room where the lamp's glow would not bite into his skin. Mostly she listened. Children talk when they know they are safe. Tommy whispered about horses he had never ridden and about a house with a porch, and Mare gave little answers like anchors. She washed his face, wiped the dust from his hair, and tucked a blanket around him that smelled like the laundry soap she trusted. People watched her with the same mixture of pity and appraisal they used on everything in Barrow's Bend. She did not ask their help. Some offered money. Most offered advice. "You shouldn't take on no child," Mrs. Larn said one evening as she stirred her tea. "It's no thing for a single gal to be messin' with. Folks'll talk." Mare did what she always did. She kept her patience. She understood, in a way that had little to do with grand words, that kindness cost something. She had paid for it a long time and kept paying. Only this time the coin's face was a child's smile. Rafe noticed. Men who spent their days reading land and cattle learn to see what is not obvious to gossip. He watched from his end of the table one night as Mare sat on the stair, a small, half-knitted cap in her hands, and the boy played at her knees. Rafe had watched storms break across the prairie and men break under less. He had not expected this soft moment to bruise whatever careful armor he wore, but it did. There was something about the way Mare tended to the boy that made him slow his chewing and watch like a man who had not been sure his heart could be trusted. He stepped toward the stair almost without thinking and set a tin cup of coffee down next to her without a word. The lamplight caught the coffee as if it were some small thing to be saved. Mare looked up, The look they exchanged was not polite or flirtatious. It was a quiet recognition, like two people discovering a common ridge amid the flat plain. Her eyes were a color of storm-beaten steel, and his were the color of the land at dusk. She offered him a small, grateful nod and tucked the cup into her palms like something private she was allowed to keep. The town, as towns do, misread manners for intent. Mr. Grimes took the sight of Mare and Rafe as license to prod. "Looks like you found yourself a protector, girl," he said loud enough to be heard. "Hope he keeps his hands off anything but fences." Mare's hands clenched in the knitted yarn, but she kept her face like a door closed against the storm. The kettle hissed. The boy laughed, and the laugh softened everything. It was the best sharp thing in the room. Rafe's jaw tightened. Men's pride often looks like something stern. He did not answer Grimes publicly the way someone else might have. He stepped in the morning instead, leading a wagon full of firewood for the boarding house. He left it in a pile that smelled of pine and work, and he left no bill. It was small, and small things in Barrow's Bend could be much larger than townsfolk wanted to admit. Mrs. Larn noticed. She noticed because she kept count of favors the way a miser keeps count of coins. "That fellow's got something to hide," she said. "Why buy a gal a pile of wood? You're making the rest of us look stingy." Mare, for her part, kept her silence. Kindness was not for making speeches. She stacked the wood, watching the way the light at the windows thinned and the room smelled different afterward. A wood smoke clean that made people breathe as if they had been given a new air to work with. For Mare, the wood meant warm nights for the child and perhaps an extra blanket to put over the shoulders of a weary man. For Rafe, it was a certainty he could give without words, a small payment on a debt he would never say aloud. If the town had a conscience, it was thin and noisy. The heavier judgments came at supper when folks sat with their plates and their opinions and folded both neatly into the days. "She's not one to flutter about with men," the preacher's wife said with a sweetness like milky tea. "She's got a past, perhaps. A girl with a child in her care might be more likely to be a mother than not. Men like him need to watch what they're doing." Mare kept her head down for days like she always did. She moved through the boarding house like someone moving through a chapel. Careful, sure, a person who knows what a sacred thing silence can be. She saved the boy from the cold nights and from the town's curiosity. In quiet moments she would take out the small things she kept. A scrap of ribbon from her daughter's dress, the faded photograph of a man whose name she had not said aloud since the day the letter came, and she would touch them as if they were small, beloved relics. No sound left her lips about what it meant to lose someone. She had built around that loss a life that could hold both the absence and the presence of those she kept safe. Rafe dropped in small tidings now and then that meant more than his quiet. He showed up with a repaired strap, or with bandages for a cut that a man had gotten into at the mill. He helped Mare mend the fence when a storm had torn it and swept it into the field like a thin, ragged ribbon. He did not parade his actions. He left them where they could be seen by eyes that looked. The town, however, required a more public show. They liked to set a stage and watch people deliver lines. And so Barrow's Bend built a problem. The council decided the road must be widened, and the only way to do it was to knock down the old boarding house porch, which had been there like a tooth in the jaw of the town for as long as anyone remembered. The porch kept the wind at bay, had sheltered kisses and last words, and had given the step a worn indentation where people had always set their heel. Removing it would expose Mare's small room to the wind, to the road, to the unkindness of people. When the proclamation was made, sheets of paper pinned to the board outside the general store and read aloud in front of the post office. People stood about and debated fine points of inconvenience. Where a new hitching post should be, which wagon would go where. Mrs. Larn and the preacher's wife spoke up as if defending the sanctity of town tradition by pointing out the need for efficiency. Mare heard of it like everyone else, through the buzz of a board game that had fewer and fewer players. She went about binding bread and pouring coffee, and the wind that had been waiting for an invitation blew harder. It was at supper the night before the demolition that the first real word struck. "They can knock the porch down all they care. It's only a few planks," Mr. Grimes said, a sort of pleasure tucked in the end of his sentence like a stonemason enjoying the break of a hammer. "Only a few planks," said the preacher's wife. The town will move forward. We can't hold every building to the past. Besides, that place is crowded with folk who shouldn't be crowding. Mare heard the laugh that chased the words, soft and sharp. Her hands stilled. The boy looked up from his cup and blinked slowly as if seeing a new kind of weather. She went out early the next morning with a broom and a stubborn mind. She began to sweep the porch not because anyone had told her to but because it had always been hers in a way that had nothing to do with deeds. She did not protest loudly. She took what she could and made it a place where people could sit until the last plank came loose. Rafe came by with his horse and stopped at the corner. He watched her sweep with something like a tide moving inside him. It was a small, private anger. Men like him, who had seen the slow rundown of a place and what it meant to lose a porch or a fence post, felt things in small, fierce ways. Perhaps he saw in Mare's sweeping a stubbornness like the fence that refused to give. Whatever the reason, he rode up and dismounted like a man who intended to help because help is a thing that cannot usually be anchored by speech. "You don't have to do that," Rafe said softly as he picked up a loose board and laid it against the nearest tree. His voice did not make a show of compassion. It simply stated the fact. Mare looked at him for a long moment, and he felt the weight of that look, strong and honest. "Might as well make it right for a minute," she said. There was a small, almost stubborn smile at the corner of her mouth. "If it's all goin' away, I'm gonna make it a nice goin'." Rafe lifted the hammer and began to pry a nail out with the kind of care that sees the value in small things. By the middle of the morning they had a pile of planks, a stack of chairs, and a broom with a well-used handle leaned against the wall. Folks walked by and muttered like a wind that could not be bothered. A crowd gathered because people would rather watch a thing fall than build it. Mrs. Larn came with a cup of tea and did not bother to hide the thin pleasure she took in disaster. "You can't save a porch with good intentions, Mare," she said. The work went on. Rafe and Mare moved like two people who had found an alignment. He did not seek applause. He handed a plank to Mare when it was needed, and she tied down a loose awning with a practiced rope's knot. The boy played with the nails, and for a moment Rafe watched him as if guarding a new kind of herd. The morning stretched toward noon and the men from town came with their own hammers, and then it happened. A plank slipped from a man who did not watch his footing, and Mr. Grimes lost his temper. "Watch it," he bellowed. "That's my property. You treat it like trash," Mrs. Larn cut in. "Note how she's clinging to it, acting like it's her legacy." The words were a crack across the painted summer of the porch, and Mare felt their sting. She felt it not as a small cut but as a weathering. She stepped back. The kettle at the back of the room made a small, angry hiss. She could have boiled with the words. Instead, she pulled the boy beside her and wrapped an arm around him like a living shield. Rafe, who had been prying a stubborn nail, straightened as if the town's sound had broken glass and raked him. He had watched such public shames before and had learned that some things could only be answered by a steady, solid statement. He wiped his hands on his coat like a man who had decided he would not shout but would not be dismissed either. "You lot think you can buy what's decent with jokes," he said, voice low and even, the kind of voice that makes a saloon quiet and dogs at the far end of the street lift their heads. "This place belongs to anyone who makes it right, and I'll have none of you call her trash." Silence fell like a blanket over the group that had come to watch. Someone laughed nervously, a sound like a dry twig breaking. Mr. Grimes reddened, his face a weathered plate. "You don't run this town, Calder," he snapped, testing the line like a rope. Rafe didn't move. "I don't want to run the town," he said. "Just don't let it run those who don't deserve it." The words were small and certain, and they had a power that soundly turned the crowd's mood. People in Barrow's Bend liked to think they were the judges of every lowly thing. When someone stepped in and shut it down, the town shifted. They muttered and looked away. A few, who had been enjoying the show, found themselves feeling the heat of something they had not accounted for. Mare felt relief as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Not because she wanted praise but because a small thing, her dignity, had been recognized. She blinked once, and the boy who had been hiding behind the fringe of her apron peeked around her knee and saw the man who had stood up for them. His eyes widened like a child catching sunlight in a new way. They did not become close in an instant. Nothing like that happens in towns with wood and dust and long histories of wounded pride. Instead, there came a string of small things that knitted two lives together. A meal left on the porch with the plate turned down so tomatoes wouldn't spatter anyone's dignity. A sack of oats dropped at the barn with no note. A small pot of basil tucked into Mare's kitchen where the herb's smell softened the room like slow rain. They met in the liminal places of the day. Over a fence mended by two hands, beside a barn where the light made the dust rise like old ghosts, at the edge of the creek where they would sometimes watch horses drink and not speak at all. In those spaces, silence was not emptiness but conversation in places where the town would not reach. Rafe began to show things he kept hidden in plain sight. Once, on a rain-splattered morning, he took out a small, worn photograph and set it on the counter while Mare diced onions. It was a picture of a woman smiling in a younger time, her hair still unframed by gray. Mare glanced at it, and the hair on her arms rose, not because she knew the woman but because she recognized the kind of loss the photograph held. She looked up at him, and for a heartbeat his eyes were not the weathered blue they always were but a rawer thing. Guilt, perhaps, or simply the weight of memory. "Lost her to the fever, that one?" he said eventually, as if placing the photograph back among the bills and the old letters. "Had 3 little ones. I owed him money. I thought I could buy time. Time can't be bought for what it takes." Mare's hands kept moving with the knife, steady as if she could keep the world in order by cutting it into measured halves. She felt odd at that, the way one feels riding a horse too long, muscles remembering what the mind had tried to forget. "Guilt's a long road," she said. It was not a consolation as much as the kind of truth that fit in a pocket like a stone. Rafe hid small kindnesses behind practical things. He fixed the Johnson boys' wagon wheel one afternoon and left a new pair of gloves at the boarding house the next. He arrived when the storm came like a promise, one of those weather promises that are small things in a world that often promises too much. He began, slowly, to tell small fragments of himself when the dusk made the room feel like a cup that would hold what was poured into it. He told her about the first steer he had ever branded and about a dog that had followed him home from the fields. Mare told him, slowly and like seasons, about the things she had held. The small frame of a photograph, a letter, a name she would not say out loud. They sat on the porch one evening with the boy between them, and he asked questions the way children do, plain, unafraid. "Why did your wife die?" The little fellow's words were blunt and maddening simply because they carried the honesty of someone insistent on learning the world's shape. Rafe closed his mouth for a moment. He smelled the evening. Dust settling, the sweet grass of cattle bleached in the sun. "Fever," he said at last. "It took her quick. I tried to do what I could. Sometimes the world is too thin a thing to hold us." Mare's hand reached and covered his on instinct, like two routines overlapping until they fit. The touch was small, a simple human acknowledgement. There was no grand declaration, just a hand, two hearts steadying each other. The town grew restless anyway. People in Barrows Bend cared for what they could change and gossiped about what they could not. A man named Elwyn Shute, who owned more land and felt the need to protect his opinion, took particular offense at Rafe's quiet assertion. Elwyn had a way of making himself into the town's conscience by sheer volume. He was sharp-dressed, land-rich, and looked at Rafe with a disdain reserved for a man who did not kneel where his word meant everything. "You got a pretty woman feeding your boarders," Elwyn said, leaning on his cane outside the saloon with a grin that did not reach his eyes. He liked to be sharp-tongued in public where his words could be taken as fact. "You'd do better to pay attention to the ledger than to the lady's smile." Rafe's reply was the kind of thing that manages to be both small and large. "I pay attention to what's worth paying attention to. The rest can mind its own business." Elwyn's eyes narrowed. He saw any affection as a claim on what he believed townsmen ought to have. He took to following Rafe's movements as if he were a detective charged with finding crimes that should not exist. It was not only men of means who watched them. The preacher's wife, who had been a shapeshifter in town politics for years, found herself drawn to the sliver of tenderness that had settled on the boarding house like a thrifted quilt. She muttered about propriety and the dangers of equating kindness with attachment. As the months passed into a slow fall, The seasons taught the town what they needed to know about change. Autumn browned the grass and tightened the lines at people's mouths. Mare and Rafe grew in small ways. A touch here, a piece of news there, the occasional walk that lasted until the stars came out and the chill told them it was time to return to the warm rooms. It was settled into a rhythm until the day when past and now collided in a loud, public moment. The sheriff's son, a fearful young man who liked to make his greatness known in small acts of cruelty, took to mocking Tommy at the market. He was the kind of boy who thought that picking on the small would make him seem large. He teased the child about his cough and the way the boy's clothes were a bit too patched. The boy tried to hold his head high like Mare had taught him, but the insults piled up like rocks in an empty cart. Mare saw it and stepped into the square between the boy and the jeers like someone stepping onto a battlefield to pull the wounded into safety. "Leave him be," she said quietly. Her words did not have the heat of anger but the cold of steel. Unyielding. The boy who had been making a spectacle of himself scoffed and pushed at the child's shoulder. Tommy fell, scraped his knee, and began to howl. Rafe came out of the general store at the sound and saw the boy on the ground and his shoulders bunched against the ridicule. He walked over as if the world drew a straight line from him to the child and nothing could stop the passage. The sheriff's son looked up and made a face full of bravado. "This ain't your town, Calder," he said. "You don't get to raise other folks' kids." Rafe's face cold. He stepped between the boy and the sheriff's son. "I ain't raisin' him," he said. "I'm keepin' him safe. You do us both a favor and keep your hands to yourself. Words gone wrong make men quick on their feet." The sheriff's son struck him. A half-hearted, childish slap. More to show himself than to hurt. Rafe, who had been in the wrong wars and had been taught the hard lesson of letting a man learn by his own bruises, stepped back. He did not answer in kind. He had a different weapon. Steadiness. He spoke low, even, and to the point. "You step away." The boy, who had been learning life's edges that day, watched with a raw attention. People gathered. The air tasted like the promissory note of a fight. The sheriff's son, not used to being spoken to plainly, went red. He spat a word, one that wanted to damage and to make a spectacle, at Mare. He called her a name the town had warmed into its mouth because the concept of a woman with a hidden past and a child was easy to condemn. Mare felt the wind leave her chest like someone had opened a trapdoor. The name landed and stung. She had held the boy in her lap through nights of fever and had brought him back to laughter from the brink of being nothing. To have her cared-for child paraded in the street like a proof of her worth, to have someone call her out by a word meant to scar, was more than the body could bear. Her hands went to the boy's hair and held him like an oath. It was Rafe who moved this time. He did not shout. He did not demand. He simply stepped forward and gripped the sheriff's son's jaw and tipped his head until what needed to be seen was seen. The arrogance in the boy's face and the smallness beneath it. "You apologize," Rafe said. "Right now." The crowd left, some with whimpers of disapproval, others with the kind of satisfaction that only comes when a bully gets a shove. The sheriff's son stammered an apology full of cowardice, and people went back to their errands, smelling bread and the last of summer's peaches. The streak of bravery in a man's soul is sometimes what saves him from being just the man he has been. After the scuffle, Mare and Rafe retreated to the boarding house porch. The evening was soft as a promise. They sat together, a small distance between them that felt neither cold nor close. Tommy slept in his bed with the iron rattle of his chest slowly evening out. "You shouldn't have put yourself in the way," Rafe said, not as rebuke but as observation. He had a way of saying things that managed to be both practical and full of care. Mare shrugged like a hand offering an old habit. "Someone had to," she answered. "Folks do what they do. I did what I could." They did not speak for long after. The night held them as if it understood gentleness. They watched the sky like two people who had once been lost and learned to find their path again in the constellations. It is in the small, unremarkable evenings that bonds form. The weeks of brewing coffee, the quiet fixing of fence, the shared ritual of setting a boy to bed. People in Barrow's Bend began to look at them less as an oddity and more like a fit that happened to be natural. But towns with long memories and thin kindnesses will test what they cannot understand. Elwin Shute, who liked his rules to be made of steel and his tastes to be proven right, decided to make his opposition into a spectacle. He believed, perhaps with good reason, that a town's moral arc bent under social pressure. He convened a meeting at the bank, inviting the prideful and the petty and the self-appointed guardians of the town's reputation. "Men," he said with a hand raised to call the attention of a room that liked to be told what to believe, "we must remind ourselves what sort of town Barrows Bend aims to be. We can't have folks stepping outside their station and thinking we will applaud them." The meeting was a litany of small slights and large judgments. People spoke of managing appearances and keeping rules simple. The undercurrent of it was clear. Mayor was to be reined in, and Rafe, a man with history and property but no thirst for parading, was to be reminded of his place. Elwin's logic read like a ledger. He believed that if enough public opinion pressed, the duo would shrink back into the neatness of what the town approved. They sent a petition. It was a paper thing stamped and signed with somber flourishes and thin righteousness. It requested that Mayor be removed from her place of influence and that the town consider stricter watch of such relations that could cause talk. Men who did not wish to make waves signed out of fear of being outcast, others from a thin conviction that Barrows Bend needed a moral spine. When Mayor heard of it, she did not let the paper's words into her hands like a weapon. She continued to cook, mend, and tend. If people wanted to make a drama of her life, she would not lend them the props. She was not a woman who wanted herself displayed like a curiosity. She had shelter to keep and a boy who loved the sound of a rooster crowing. The petition, she told herself, was a storm she would walk through as if she had walked through others. Rafe, however, felt as if someone had thrown a rock at the lake and kept throwing until the waves rose. He had not sought to make his life a spectacle. He wanted to tend to cattle and to pay bills and to sleep with a letter in his pocket that connected him to a time he regretted. The petition, in his mind, was a public rejudgment that threatened the small peace they had built. He thought, perhaps too much, of the small child and of what such judgments could do. The town, for all its interest in order, had a chaos inside it that sometimes led to a reckoning. The meeting authorized a kind of public hearing, a time when people could speak their grievances and make a town's conscience feel like a trial. Elwin smiled as if he had summoned thunder and that it would strike appropriately. He imagined the weight of his words bending the town to his view. When the hearing was announced, the boarding house filled with more people than it had seen in years. The room smelled of formal suits, steam from coffee, and the old smell of wood that had seen decades of dinners. Men stood like referees who had been given a whistle. Women sat like juries waiting to deliver a verdict. The sheriff sat up front, with his hands in his lap and his eyes calculating what it would mean to pick a side. Rafe and Mayor sat at one end of the long table. The boy clung to Mayor's skirt, looking small and fierce. The kettle hissed and the lamplight glowed. There was an odd hush that falls when people gather to watch others be exposed. Elwin, with the zeal of a man who believed he was the townskeeper, spoke first. He did not call names explicitly. He did not need to. He invoked the town's welfare and the danger of letting outside sentiment seep into Barrows Bend. The words were the sort of slow poison that tastes like righteousness. Mayor listened without flinching. She had been through worse public recoil. She knew how men and women like to air other people's wrongs like a purchasable cloth. When she was given time to speak, her voice was low but steady. She spoke of the boarding house's breakfasts, of the boy who had come like a wounded thing needing a place, of the work that needed doing regardless of town opinion. She refused to make grand speeches about virtue. To her, virtue was the slow, daily attention to things that needed it. Rafe did not speak much. His face kept an even mask. But when he rose, the room noticed how a man with the quiet of the plains could draw a line without anger. He said simply, "This town's better when we don't set ourselves to breaking what folks build. If you want to judge, then judge what's in front of you, not what you fear it might be. Mayor Hollis keeps this house for people who need it. That's a fact, and it's not wrong." The words were small but clean as a blade. People looked at each other and then at the pieces of paper they had signed. In the end, the petition fell apart not because of a dramatic conversion but because the town's practical bent could not abide making a useful woman into an example. The signatures were rescinded by many who realized it was easier to walk away than to keep pushing. Elwyn muttered and left with a dignified, snarled expression. The sheriff kept his head down for a while after, measuring the town's temper for signs of rebellion. When the hearing ended, people drifted away like a tide. It was a victory, small and dull, and it settled like a stone in the river. Mayor and Rafe sat on the porch, tired. The night kept its own counsel. For once, both of them felt more than a small thing toward the other, a movement from the edges toward something that could be named without needing to call it love. They still spoke in practicalities. There is gentleness in doing things for another without fanfare, in making a life that both fits and grows. Rafe's hands showed their history in the smallness of scars and the large, sure lines. Mare's hands were like an old, trusted instrument, useful and never asking for applause. They reached across the gap between them with simple acts. A coat draped over a shoulder the night the wind cut hard. A mending of a tear without comment. A quiet statement that said what needed to be said and let the rest of life fill the silence. Months moved like a steady, rewarding work. The fields turned and the cattle thickened. The boy grew stronger and laughed more. Barrow's Bend, in its small ways, made room. There were still sneers, sharp words and corners, and people who looked for cracks in what had been made. But there was also the bacon given without asking, the neighbor's horse watched over at night, and the general store owners offered to fix a wheel in the event of trouble. Rafe left small things at the kitchen door. A loaf, a small bowl of fresh cheese, a note, always without fanfare. Mare accepted it as one accepts rain. Grateful, practical, and never ostentatious. Then, as it often does in small lives, the past came knocking in a louder, less intrusive way. A man arrived in town one chilly morning, wearing a coat that had once been suited to a better life. He stopped at the inn looking for Rafe Calder. He had walked a long way and his cheeks were chapped. He introduced himself with a name that sounded like an old scratch on a ledger. The man had been a creditor, a business partner in the years that had made Rafe a success and then a debtor. He had a paper and a list of claims that made men tremble. Rafe's face changed when he saw him. It was a crack more than a shift, one that made Mare watch. The man placed a letter on the table, stamped and official, and Rafe's hand brushed it as if it were something alive and dangerous. He said little. He stood with his back to the world like a man who had been taught not to plead. "I need an answer," the man said in a voice that had been sharpened by pressing men into promises. He wanted land, he wanted cattle, and he wanted blood he thought was due. Rafe's jaw tightened. He had not told Mare the full weight of his debts. He had given her only the outline of his life and the small, human truth that he carried a letter in his pocket and secrets under his hat. He might have thought to spare her worry. He might have been wrong to keep the thought away. Either way, the coming days would test what they had built. When the man left, the board at the general store carried the news like a small bell. People speculated. People bought more bread. The town that had once stood up for him now saw him as a man with a hole in his fortune. Elwyn, if he had any marrow of mercy, only kept it hidden. Rafe did what men like him did. He made plans that felt like armor. He took to riding out at dawn and coming back under a thin moon, making small deals and rearranging stock like a man who knew how to play the land's ledger. He spent nights awake in his small room, the letter like a locket of trouble. Mare watched him with the kind of attention that did not ask questions but catalogued what she saw. She handed him hot coffee sometimes without asking for a reply. She could read the weight of someone's steps as if they were braille. He told her, finally, one evening as they mended a fence by the light of a falling sun. He leaned his back against a post and looked at the land, the cattle, the sky, and then he looked at her like a man laying down a small piece of armor. "It's a claim against the ranch," he said. "I thought I could keep it at bay. I was wrong." Mare's hands went quiet on the rope. She had a way of listening that had nothing to do with waiting. She let the words come into her as if she were cataloging a storm. "What will you do?" she asked. Rafe blew out a breath, and it was as if he blew out a small debt. I'll sell the north field to square it. I'll work harder. He stopped at the simple admission. I don't want the boy to be caught in it. I don't want you to be caught. Mare watched as if she were reading the weather by the color of clouds and not by the thunder. If you sell the field, then there's bread for the winter, she said. It will be hard, but you'll keep the rest. He shook his head. It's not enough. She did not press. She had a stubbornness carved out of necessity. She knew how things folded when you made them smaller to fit a budget. We'll do what needs doing, she said. Her voice was not brave in a loud way, but in the small courage of someone who has found that an answer is often a slow, steady thing. Rafe, touched by her quiet resolve, touched her wrist with a hand that had been taught how to hand a man's fear with gentleness. You don't have to, he began, meaning the rest of what he knew. He was about to say that she did not have to help, that he would not ask for the sharing of a burden that she had not offered. He stopped because it felt wrong to pretend shame where there had been nothing but human generosity. Mare looked him in the eye. We help each other around here, she said. It was not a promise to him alone, but to the life they had both been building slowly like a stone wall. One rock at a time with simple mortar. Rafe looked at her then as if a gate had opened. He had not used many words with her, but in the space between them something full and final settled. He reached across the fence and took her hand like the simplest of declarations. You ain't just a guest in my cabin, he said, the voice low and certain as a bell. You're the queen of my heart. There was no flourish in it, no shiny buckle, just a man saying what he had been made to feel. Mare's breath caught like a horse startled at new weather. The statement landed softly and fully. She had kept her heart's borders tight for a long time, for reasons we learn and for reasons we will never fully explain. His words were not a claim. They were a shelter being offered, an inheritance of trust. She let herself be a little reckless and reached for him, and for once the wary parts of her stepped aside. The thing about towns and secrets is that anyone who whispers can start a storm. News of Rafe's debt and of Mare's involvement reached ears and was dried and served in portions. The man who had brought the claim returned with others who wanted a taste of what they thought they could take. It is far easier to take what you think belongs to another than to build what you need. They argued at the bank. They called Rafe poor stewardship. They looked at him with the naked face of those who measure a man by what he owns. Rafe did not flinch. He signed papers and rearranged what he had with a solemnity that felt like prayer. He gave up what he could and kept what he must. Mare helped quietly, but she did not throw herself into saving a man's name. She wanted a life where names mattered less and deeds mattered more. She fixed him a meal one night when he came back from the office of law with dust on his boots and smoke in his eyes. She did not ask. She only offered the food as if a human being ought to have enough to eat. When the last agreement was made, the town turned to whatever next drama it could find. Elwyn muttered his opprobrium like an old man sighing. The sheriff cleared his desk and took a breath. The general store owner sold his wares. Life in Barrow's Bend turned back to its slow, meaningful chores. And then winter came like a patient thief, quiet and sure. Snow lay on the fence rails and made hills of the dusty ridges. The boarding house warmed in small ways. Mothballs rubbed from the corners, extra blankets folded like small promises, and a kettle that kept humming as if to defy the cold. Mare and Rafe settled into a life that was both practical and tender. They did not speak of rings or vows. They spoke in the simpler language of people who had both been burned and had learned to be careful with heat. On a night when the wind made a small howl and the lamplight threw their silhouettes long across the floor, Tommy came into the parlor with a scrap of paper he had found. It was an advertisement of sorts, a line in small print. Town dance, New Year's Eve. The boy's eyes shone like coins. He wanted to learn how to dance as most boys do. He wanted a kind of normal that the boarding house had taught him existed. Mare looked at Rafe, and for once neither of them needed a word. They both knew how dances in small towns build futures. They prepared clothes for the boy and for themselves. Mare found a dress she had kept stashed away. A simple thing, peaceful in its plainness. Rafe found a coat and brushed dust from the old lapel until it shone a small, gentle shine. The dance was a place where the town's thin faces could be made tender. People came with hope soaked into their shoes. The music began. A fiddle that played old reels and a piano that kept the beat like a metronome. They danced with the uncertain joy of people who had learned to carry their burdens lightly for an evening. Rafe danced like someone who had remembered his feet. Mare, at his side, moved like a woman who had once been taught to keep her balance in storms. They did not need to speak to say what the other had longed to hear. On the porch outside, after the last song, Rafe took her hand. The night was sharp and clean and smelled of a future they had not yet named. He looked at her as if deciding, finally, that the time had come to stop being so cautious. "You stay," he said. It was not a command or a request but the simple declaration of a man offering a life. "Stay with me. Keep the porch of the house. Keep the boy. Keep whatever of yours I can't buy." Mare's eyes filled with things he could not yet read: relief, tenderness, a sea of small, steady gratitude. "I'll stay," she said. And they both felt the small, seismic shift of a life joined with a promise as plain and strong as a fence post. They faced storms and plague of small emergencies. The mine's disaster nearby that sent men to them for warm beds. The cattle that needed counting. The cold that took more than it should. But between the harshness of life and the soft moments that make it bearable, their lives nodded. Rafe, who had been a man of weather and debts, learned to be a man of patience with a child who called him Mr. at first, and then learned a way to say the man's name like a small prayer. Mare, who had once kept herself a single, reliable thing, let pieces of her life go down into another's hands and grow roots. The town settled into a new rhythm where their forms were not scandal but the simplest kind of peace. Years, that patient and sometimes merciless ruler, taught them what circumstances could not. They kept a small garden together. Mare introduced new herbs, and Rafe, who had grown used to brutal, necessary chores, learned to plant seedlings with the same care he had given to a sick steer. Tommy became a young man with a laugh that made the children in the street grin by reflex. Barrow's Bend, that town of thin, loud judgments and surprising tenderness, made room for them in its daily round. If anyone thought them saint-like, they were mistaken. They argued like any two people who share a hearth. There were nights when Rafe's past would come back to hook him like a fishhook, and he would be silent for a day, and Mare would know that his quiet was an old pain resurfacing. There were times when Mare would want to keep a memory like an heirloom and would stay quiet, and Rafe would simply sit with her until she found the words. Their life was not a book of flawless lines but a ledger of human mistakes and small, steady making rights. The town watched them with a slow acceptance. Children grew up knowing the two of them as fixtures. The barber would tell stories of their dances. The blacksmith would join in remembrances of the day a fence had been mended with two hands. People came to them for small favors, and they gave as though kindness were a well with a steady supply. If there was a moment that sealed the town's acceptance, it was not an act of bravado but a small public one. When the county hired a crew to fix a section of the road in front of the boarding house and the cost fell on Rafe's old creditors, the whole town came together. They pitched in to help clear the old porch's foundation and paid in goods and labor where money was scarce. Perhaps they had learned that what built a town up was not the wealth of one man but the small, persistent acts of 1,000 hands. Or perhaps they had simply come around to the idea that Mare was worth saving because she was the one who had quietly tended them all along. It is a curious thing how simple gestures can alter the shape of the world. Rafe kept the photograph he had once had, now hollowed with the absence of the one it showed, on a shelf with a small new frame he had bought for Mare. He had never thought to gift anyone with anything as bold as a ring. His gifts were always things that had to do with weather and barns and wheat. But once, on a morning when frost had painted the yard silver and the sun cut low, he sent Tommy on an errand into town to fetch something, and on Tommy's return he had with him a tiny ribbon-bound box. Mare opened it like one does a small blessing and found inside a simple band of metal. No gold, no flourish, just a ring with a name etched inside, lawless. She pressed the ring to her lips the way people pressed coins once upon times of poverty and gratitude. "Put it on," Rafe said, voice small as a prayer. The words had no flourish. They were a plain thing that burned like a steady lamp. Mare slid the ring on and let it find her finger. To fit like the answer to a question you had stopped asking. She looked at him and felt all the small, daily acts settle like honey into everything. "I will," she said. "Where we go from here we take it slow. But I'm yours." Rafe smiled then, the kind of smile that was less a curve and more a line of light. He did not speak the grand lines the town liked to recite in tales, but he took her hand and pressed it to his chest like a man stamping a letter. They lived after as people who had learned to keep one another when the world's cold wanted to take everything. They found their contentments in the everyday. A child's chuckle, a soft rain, a fence that held. They kept their quarrels short and their love long. The town, in time, liked telling the story of Mayor Hollis and Rafe Calder like a small sermon. How kindness could be its own currency, and how a town should be judged by the way it treated those who had been through storms. It is easy in these kinds of stories to end with a grand ring or a line that sets the world right with perfect closure, but their lives were not made for that kind of scene. They were made of the small stitches that make a garment last. Steady, patient, sometimes dull, always practical. There was nothing melodramatic in the way they mended fences or in their small tiffs. No dramatic expansions of hate in the town, and only occasional, quiet reckonings. But there was the slow accrual of love, that weathered, honest thing that keeps hands warm on long nights. Years later, sitting on the porch that had once been threatened and then saved, Mare looked out at the town. The same low buildings, the same dusty lanes, and saw that the world had been altered in small ways. The boy who had once been coughing and pale now owned a horse and a laugh. Rafe, with his scarred hands and steady eyes, was a man the town could count on. They had wards and friends and a porch that sheltered more than a body. It sheltered a life. In the quiet that settled like a shawl across their days, Mare sometimes remembered the beginning. The way people had called her just the help. The way the wind had bitten at the boarding house step. The way a man had once judged her with publicly sharp words. She felt those old edges with a stinging memory, and then let the memory go like the small leaves fall in winter. It had been a hard lesson to learn that the things you do quietly can build a life. But build a life they did. They kept on with the small work of living. They ate together. They fixed each other's missteps. They made space for the boy to be his own man. And when Rafe took her hand some evening, as simple as the setting of a sun, to say that she had always been the queen of his heart, Mare felt the words settle like a valuable dust and then become something more, a truth that would not need proving. If you walked by the now stable porch of the boarding house in Barrow's Bend, you might have heard the kettle's soft hiss through the window and the sound of two people speaking in the quiet language of shared chores. You might have seen the boy, no longer a boy, ride by and tip his hat. You might have watched Mare look up from the garden and Rafe turn his head and smile like the land approving the weather. You might have felt, for a moment, that everything had been made right in a way that didn't need thunder. And that's how a whisper changed a town. If her story hit you hard, if somewhere under your skin you felt the ache of someone kept quiet yet indomitable, then remember the ones who stay. Remember that people who keep their heads down are not always bowing. They might be steadying themselves for a day that needs them to be brave. If you see someone clearing a porch or mending a fence, lend a hand, not with judgment but with a warmness that doesn't ask for recompense. She gave everything without asking, and finally someone gave back. For more tales of dusty hearts and clean redemption, hit subscribe, partner.